Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel titled The Great Transformation and the Promise of International Economic Law. We have four great panelists who will each take about 10 minutes, and thereafter we shall have some interaction. So first I will introduce them, and then they will go in that order. I am James Gavi. I teach at Loyola University, Chicago. Our first panelist will be Simon Lester, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on WTO disputes, regional trade agreements, disguised protection, and the history of international trade law. Before joining Cato, he worked as a legal affairs officer at the Appellate Body Secretariat of the WTO, and he founded the international trade law website, tradelaw.net. Our second panelist will be Manjot Chi or Cliff Chi, who is a professor of law at the University of International Business and Economics in China, and the founding director of the School Center for International Economic Law and Policy. His recent research focuses on international economic law, dispute settlement, sustainable development. He's a frequent speaker around the world, like all our speakers, and he's the founding editor-in-chief of the Asian Yearbook of International Economic Law. Our third speaker will be Daphne Hong, the Director General, International Affairs Division of the Attorney General's Chambers in Singapore, where she started her legal career in 1991 as a judicial officer in the Singapore judiciary. She has then moved on to many things, including in 2006 moving into the International Affairs Division, where she undertook international law advisory and negotiation work covering the entire range of international law issues. She was attached to Singapore's permanent mission to the UN in New York as legal advisor from 2009. From 2010 to 15, her primary focus was in international economic law. And then in August of 2016, she was appointed Director General of the International Affairs Division, and she heads the legal department that advises the government on all international law matters, including international economic law. Our last speaker who couldn't join us, who has a recorded video, is Anchang Kim Shin, who is a senior associate at the Chicago office of Baker and McKenzie, concentrating on U.S. export controls, U.S. economic and trade sanctions, U.S. customs and import laws, among many other things. And her assistance extends to voluntary disclosure filings to and enforcement actions brought by the U.S. government in relation to such laws and regulations, speaks frequently as well, and regularly counsels Korea-based companies on various issues doing business globally. This session is sponsored by Dechet LLP. And now I'm delighted to have Simon proceed with his comments.
Well, thank you very much, James. And it's good to be with you all virtually in this greatly transformed ASIL annual meeting. I'm going to start off by talking about the first great transformation or the previous great transformation in the world trading system, and then talk about whether perhaps we are in the midst of another great transformation, already in the midst of it or coming up soon. So the last transformation of the world trading system occurred in 1995 after the Uruguay round led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. We had a fragmented, struggling GATT system, and we turned that into a much improved World Trade Organization with new rules in a number of areas, intellectual property and services, an improved dispute settlement system, a unified structure, and a formal institution. The WTO started off with great promise after this transformation, but it soon began to struggle, and we saw civil society protests, the famous battle in Seattle. More importantly, probably I would say, is we saw this split between developing countries and industrialized countries on what level of commitments each should take on. So progress on negotiations was slow. The next big round, the Doha round, started in 2001, but it stalled, and there was some debate about when it was formally declared over and dead. But at this point, we can say the Doha round is over. in my opinion, all of that discord was manageable. I mean, my view is that we should celebrate what was achieved as part of the World Trade Organization rather than fret about what was not achieved. The Uruguay round was a really big deal. And personally, I was content to let that settle in, let people adjust to it. I think you can go too far with international governance and experience an even greater backlash, countries leaving the system. And that's not where we are with the WTO. We'll get to that in a second. What may be unmanageable, however, right now is this growing rivalry between the two biggest players in the system, China and the United States. And let me apologize here to my friends in the European Union. You are also a very big player. But I do think that the Europeans maybe play slightly less role than the two great powers that are out there. What I'm going to talk about today is whether either China's introduction to the system or Trump's and the United States under the Trump administration's turn to economic nationalism could lead to a new transformation of the world trading system. This transformation could be formal abandonment. It could mean merely a big disruption, or it could mean actual reform. So let me talk about these two possibilities: the China's introduction to the entry into the system, and what's going on with the Trump administration. So with China, it has been said that China is unique. Its size, its authoritarian politics, its state-led economy make it a challenge for the WTO to handle it. I'm not convinced by this argument. I mean, I think there's something to it, but it's not as strong as some people say. And so there's sort of two main reasons. One is that China's differences from everyone else are more a matter of degree than of kind. And then second, China's behavior at the WTO, I would say so far, has been not too bad. I mean, not perfect, but nobody is. So let me just elaborate a little bit on each of those points. So in terms of whether China is unique, China is certainly a big country in terms of population and the economy, but there are other large countries out there that are part of the system. I would say that international rules help with disciplining big countries, and it can certainly be a challenge to deal with them within the system. But it's better than a power-based system of international relations where you don't have these institutions and rules to govern things. In terms of its authoritarian nature, yes, that is true about China, but it's also true of a number of other WTO members. China is not that unique in this regard. And then with regard to the state-led economy, state-owned enterprises, this to me seems like less of a problem than many people anticipate. So I look at existing WTO rules. You have, for a long time, you've had GATT Article 17, which deals with state trading enterprises, which is kind of a subset of state-owned enterprises. You have rules on state-owned enterprises in China's accession protocol. So I don't think we have to break new intellectual ground to deal with China's state-led economy. Again, it's a question of degree. Yes, China is bigger, has more of these enterprises. They play a bigger role in international trade, but this isn't something we haven't seen before. Moving to China's behavior, I mean, there's this impression that China never complies with the rules. It's a cheater. Along with some colleagues, I took a look at how China responds to WTO complaints brought against it, and it seems to us that its record is pretty good. Again, not perfect, but nobody's is. There's a question you might ask: well, why is China fairly good at complying with WTO complaints brought against it? If it doesn't have the rule of law within its own country, why is it complying with the rule of law in the international trading system? I mean, part of the answer might just be that China knows that other countries were worried about how it might behave, so it wants to send the right signal here. In other areas of the trading system, so trade policy review mechanism, China's participation in various WTO committees, my sense is they've been an active and positive member in most regards. I think there are some gaps in their behavior with regard to notification of certain trade measures. But generally speaking, what I've seen, they played a positive role in contributing to just discussions at the WTO. On negotiations, I mean, I think that there are examples where China has been a bit of a problem in holding things up. But again, I mean, this is not unique. Everybody is like that. Every country has its flaws in this regard. So are there gaps in related to China's membership? Should China do more now that it's wealthier? I think yes, and I think there are ways that the United States and other countries can get at this. But I don't think that so far we could say that China has transformed the WTO. Certainly livened things up and presented some challenges. And then with regard to the question of whether China will in the future transform the WTO, I don't get the sense that it's looking to do that. I do think a player that big might be able to, which leads me to the other great power here, and that's the United States. There's certainly plenty of talk about transformation of the WTO. So President Trump talks about withdrawing from the WTO, maybe once a week, once a month. I mean, you'll hear a comment like that. There's a U.S. senator recently wrote a famous, notorious op-ed talking about abolishing the WTO. I think a lot of these statements are just for domestic audiences, really, and I don't know how seriously we should take them. They seem like somewhat of a fantasy, but there is also reality here, and that underneath all this rhetoric, the Trump administration is actually, proposing some substantial changes to the WTO. And so we've got I have four categories here. One is the role of developing countries. Two is notifications of trade measures. Three is the role of non-market economies in the system. And then four is the appellate body in the dispute settlement system. And the first three of these are actually mostly about China. The fourth is more independent. So let me try to run through these quickly. So on developing countries, there's a long dispute in the GATT-WTO about the level of commitments that poorer countries should take on. There's this tradition of special and differential treatment, and countries are able to self-declare whether they are developing countries. And I think there have been legitimate criticisms here that countries who are actually very wealthy are declaring themselves developing countries when maybe they should take on greater responsibility. And again, China is the big player here, second largest economy in the world. GDP per capita is not as great as some others, but it's getting a lot wealthier. So the Trump administration has proposed bringing in some objective criteria to this question of who's a developing country, and is trying to push some countries to graduate from their developing country status and take on greater commitments. On notifications, the Trump administration is very concerned about the lack of transparency with certain trade measures, and it proposed tough new rules for countries who don't notify properly. And again, China is a big part of this problem. Subsidies provided to state-owned enterprises are thought to be, not transparent enough. We'd like to bring light to exactly what China is doing in this regard. Somewhat related to that is that this role, the participation, the impact of having non-market economies as part of the system. There's a view in the Trump administration that China the nature of China's economy is just too disruptive. The final big transformation that the United States might be proposing here is the long-standing U.S. concerns about the appellate body and the WTO dispute settlement system, its rulings on trade remedies in particular. These are long-standing concerns of the U.S., but the Trump administration has elevated them. And as a response to this, they've effectively blocked the appellate body from functioning. And we're in this uncertain state where we don't know how WTO dispute settlement is going to work right now, and the EU has led an initiative to create an alternative appeals mechanism. So it certainly seems like transformation is possible here, but it's going to take a few months or longer to work it out. So the question I would leave you with is, could these U.S. actions from the Trump administration lead to some degree of transformation? I think they could. I think the Trump administration is in a good negotiating position here. They see limited value in the WTO, so they're not worried about breaking it. So yeah, that's the great position you want to be in when you're negotiating, because you don't see, they don't necessarily see the destruction of the WTO as that great a loss. At the same time, they are taking confrontational actions. So the way they've approached the appellate body issues and the national security tariffs they've imposed, I think make it difficult to unify anyone behind a particular transformation. So I guess what I would leave you with is I think that a future U.S. administration could pick up on these themes and really push the WTO in a new direction on some of these issues, some smaller, some larger. But I think it's too early to say. We have a big election coming up in the United States. Many other things could happen. And so we don't know yet. We'll just have to watch and see how it goes. So I think I've gone over 10 minutes and I'm going to stop now, and I'm eager to hear what others have to say and talk about these issues in the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Simon. That's great start for the conversation. I like your framing of, are we at a moment of abandonment or disruption or actual reform that might lead to transformation? So now we have Cliff for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And good evening from Chinese time. It's a pleasure to join this panel, a distinguished panel. Simon just mentioned about the transformations, and what I want to say is about the promise. Whether we do have a promise from the existing international economic law, and what is that promise mean to the international community? So the real question that I see is whether or not the current international investment and trade rules and institutions are sufficient to deliver a trade order that is benefiting all states or the majority of the states. The reason why I ask this question is that I do see a kind of transformation, the transformation of values of the existing trading order. The values is from the transformation from a free trade to a fair trade. We have heard that from different perspectives, especially from what the U.S. President Donald Trump has mentioned many times. U.S. wants fair trade. I would say that fair trade is not only what the U.S. wants; it's probably every country would want, but from a different perspective. And there are some changes. And the reason that I ask this, and let me start from the WTO rules. WTO rules, from a normative perspective, is a very complicated system. But that being said, if we have a close look at the WTO rules, and then we find this kind of value change or the value concentration from on trade, free trade, and to fair trade. Uh, I believe that every one of us would probably agree that the WTO is theoretically partly based on the notion of guaranteeing the free trade, which is supposed to be beneficial to all countries in the world. But now we see the fair trade. But now the existing rules in the WTO, for example, what are the fair trade rules in the WTO? How do we perceive the term fair trade? Strictly speaking, this is not a legal term in the WTO law or in other trade law areas. What I see are the two dimensions of understanding this fair trade. I would say, well, different countries may have different perspectives of this kind of fair trade understanding. And one way to see the fair trade is subnotional value of free trade, meaning that fair trade is something that is subnotional to a free trade. That country may want free trade together with fair trade, or how to guarantee a fair trade within the free trade system. In this regard, I believe that the WTO rules do have certain fair trade rules, and these rules cater, for example, mostly to the developing countries. How the developing countries, how the WTO would be made to facilitate developing countries in integrating into the global trading system. So that is so-called, in a sense, the development issue in the WTO. But another dimension, which uh, emphasize that fair trade is a parallel value to free trade, which does not necessarily mean that free trade and fair trade are conflicting with each other, but there are some tensions. Here, if we see the fair trade in this dimension, we do have some WTO rules as well. And these rules are not really so many. These rules are mainly embodied in the WTO rules with regard to trade remedy, to the safeguard anti-dumping subsidy. So in this kind of measures, of course, if a country is harmed by the imports from another country, then basically the importing country would be able to take certain measures. These kind of rules would, in a sense, guarantee a kind of fair trade to the countries that receiving countries. But aside from this, I really have to agree that the rules in the WTO agreements or WTO law more broadly do not uh, seem to be sufficient in guaranteeing a fair trade system. Although we have to admit that, well, different countries may have different understanding of fair trade. So that being said, I have questions to myself. Now, what is fair trade? That has been basically argued. There are two kind of dimensions. And then the more probably more important issue to us is how to defend fair trade. This would be a problem that we are in nowadays. One way, of course, is to increase or enhance the rule delivery or the delivery of trade rules to the world. And now we actually do see some trend. For example, if we have a look at some regional trade agreements, then we see that some of these agreements, like TPP or now CPTPP, do have more rules that are supposed to be used for guaranteeing fair trade. A particular example would be some of these regional trade agreements include a state-owned enterprise, a state-led economy provisions, or to address these kind of situation. Um, and another way to increase the provision of these rules would be the arrangements among trading powers on an ad hoc basis. And in this regard, we do see, for example, US, European Union, the European Union and Japan has for several times agreed or issued a declaration with regard to trade remedy measures, how to deal with this, with the situation or the challenges posed by the state-led economy, especially by China. So we do have this kind of rules that are emergent nowadays, not necessarily in the formal way as WTO rules. But then the next issue with these rules, is that enough, or how do we defend fair trade? And this is the problem. I believe that we see the diversity, and many of these diversified rule ways are not really appealing to the international community. We see different ways to try to defend this the fair trade. For example, we see unilateral and national ways, and this is predominantly taken by the United States. U.S. president has taken a lot of unilateral elections or nationalist actions in order to defend the fair trade that he or the U.S. Sees. I wouldn't say that is completely wrong or irrational, but that is, of course, uh, to a certain extent inconsistent with the WTO rules, and that is, more importantly, I would say, that would harm the leadership of the United States or erode the leadership of the United States at the global level, uh, without regard to the WTO rules. And then we also see that from an institutional perspective, we see that existing institutions are to some extent marginalized. We see the crisis of the WTO. We already see the dysfunction of the appellate body of the WTO around half a year ago. Now the WTO is in deep crisis, and we don't see an immediate solution to this crisis. Now, we do see that there are also kind of way to defend this fair trade. Another way is to receive the so-called reciprocal treatment. Um, Again, I think it's really difficult to describe the term reciprocal in the trade law as a trade law term. It's difficult. Does that mean necessarily that the countries would be on the same level? If country A gives a certain amount, country B would give the same amount. and how. But that's, of course, an ideal situation. But in fact, I believe that this is not that ideal. So we do see all these things. These things are popping up. And the China-US trade war, I would have to say, is a vivid illustration of these two issues. Namely, whether the existing trade rules and institutions are sufficient in guarantee of fair trade. And US and China do have different perspectives. Uh, and then the second is how to defend a fair trade. I mean, US and China, both countries have taken some unilateral measures already in this regard. No country would be able to some extent, to go to the WTO. And of course, uh, for the panel, dispute settlement panel is okay, but for the appellate body, that's already dysfunctional. So things are becoming uncertain now. I think in the future, what I see the trend is that the transformation from free trade to fair trade would underline the development of the global trading system in the future, and it is too early for us to argue uh, who is right, or which country is right and which country is wrong. I would rather take a more constructive perspective on this. I would rather encourage that all countries, including academia, to really reflect the existing rules and institution and to find consensus and build consensus as to what a fair trade would mean at the global level, taking into all kinds of different needs, economic needs, sustainable development needs, and the special needs of least developed countries, and then try to develop new rules. But of course, I understand in the same time that this seems to be very ideal. If you have a look at the WTO negotiation, that was not really successful. But I believe that the first step for the global for the international community to get prepared for this transformation and to ensure that international economic law would be able to deliver a promise to a fair trade is, first of all, the consensus building. So with that, I shall return the floor back to James. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cleve, for those remarks, and in particular bringing back the debate about fair trade and what that might or might not mean. So now, Daphne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion together with such distinguished panelists. I am a government legal advisor to the Singapore government, but let me just start with caveating that the comments I'm going to be making today is given in my personal capacity. But that said, given my experience, necessarily my views are going to be colored by my experience as a government advisor. And do forgive me if it stems from a very government-centric viewpoint. When I looked at the title of this session, The Great Transformation, the Promise of International Economic Law, the first thought that came to my mind is the transformation of Singapore as a nation through the use of international trade and underpinned by international economic law. So I thought I should just introduce a little about Singapore. We attained independence 55 years ago only. In 1965, we are a small city-state, only 700 square kilometers in size. We do not have natural resource. We do not even produce enough water for survival. In the beginning, we pursued a strategy whereby we welcomed investments, allowed open trade in goods and services, and essentially opened Singapore to the world and made the world its hinterland to trade and to do business with. We became a WTO member in 1995. Before that, we were a member of GATT since 1973. In the past decades, Singapore entered into 42 bilateral investment treaties, signed 14 free trade agreements with bilateral partners, and another 11 regional free trade agreements, including CPTPP, and many as a member of ASEAN. Singapore's GDP per capita was USD $516 back in 1965 when we became independent. Last year, our GDP per capita recorded almost US dollars 64,000. So that's an increase by a few hundred times over. So my view about this, it is indeed globalization and technological advancements in the recent decades that have led to, which have led to an explosion in international trade, investment, and other economic collaborations, which have brought tremendous opportunities to many countries, especially Singapore, and enabled us to develop and prosper to the benefit of our people. So I see international economic law as an indispensable ingredient that oils international trade and commerce. So I've listened with great interest to Cliff talking about free trade transforming to fair trade. But my view has always been IEL promotes clarity and certainty. If you're talking about fair trade in whose view? Whereas we see the rules promoted by IEL as promoting clarity and certainty in the rules that apply to free trade and commerce. And in many instances, in our FTAs and bids, we have even liberalized trade to give further opportunities and open access to markets around the world. So in my view, IEL gives assurance to traders and investors that countries will adhere to a clear set of rules as well as a system of mandatory dispute settlement mechanism. So it is this system that has allowed Singapore to grow from an undeveloped small town to a thriving metropolis. So I guess I have painted quite a rosy picture, but given our mindset that being pro-free trade, let me move on to what I see as some challenges in recent times to this international economic legal order as we know it. I would like to touch on two aspects which my fellow panelists has also alluded to, and if I have time, a third aspect. So first, some observations on whether international investment law, and in particular, the investor-state dispute system is under threat. Secondly, whether we are seeing a trend of protectionism or retreat from international trade, in particular, whether what challenges this is wreaking on the multilateral trading system, in particular under the WTO. And lastly, if there's time, I would like to touch a little on the challenges that are revealed by the COVID-19 situation and how I see international trade and hence IEL may respond to this. So first on international investment law, there has been explosion of investor-state arbitration, which has attracted a fair amount of controversy. There have been deep concerns that have been expressed by states, ranging from inter alia, the broad interpretation given to certain investment disciplines, multiplicity of proceedings by companies and shareholders across many platforms in WTO facing states facing suits, in investment arbitration suits. We have also seen inconsistency of decisions by different arbitration panels and real issues of legitimacy of the investor-state disputes process themselves, including on the conduct and the independence of arbitrators. So this situation, to me, appears to have been exacerbated by the availability of third-party funding. So has this resulted in a movement away from, when we sign on to bilateral investment treaties, we see it as the traditional role of arbitration as a remedy of last resort to check excesses of governmental action. Have we now moved to a situation whereby there's an increasing use of arbitration as a tool of leverage by investors to advance its interests in government regulatory policymaking and discourse? So for many states, even including investment importing states like Singapore, we see economic growth. We see the whole trade and investment system as not just about economic growth, but also quality of life issues, such as environment and public health concerns. And there are trade-offs that need to be struck, and a balance that needs to be struck among many competing goals. Yet, these concerns do not necessarily feature in decision-making by investors, in particular, investors with deep pockets, who may be tempted to try their luck to take on states through arbitration, even in cases where prospects of success are not high, but as long as the financial stakes are high, they are in it. So it does not help that there is a plethora of arbitration tribunals operating in parallel, investment law getting quite fragmented, and there's a fair amount of fuzziness in some areas of investment law. So for many states, including Singapore, getting embroiled in expensive arbitration is particularly challenging, even if we were to emerge victorious in defending policies or measures. So I see that this has resulted in some states denouncing their BITs, or alternatively trying to contract out of or negotiate out of investor-state arbitration provisions. So for the above reasons, I welcome the ongoing work of the UNCITRAL Working Group 3. I hope that this work would restore some order to this area of international economic law. I now move quickly on to international trade law. I've prepared, some points, but because Cliff has already touched on it, I would just quickly summarize because I see time is also getting short. In recent times, we are observing severe stresses on the multilateral trading system, in particular in WTO. In fact, in the December issue of the Economic Times last year, they dramatically pose a very provocative question. Will WTO shut down in 2020? So we have seen WTO ceasing to function. We have also seen a number of WTO disputes in which states are seeking to invoke the security exceptions in very creative ways, in my view, to justify breaches of international trade obligations. Fortunately, a WTO panel had issued what I consider to be a very balanced panel report, setting out the principles applicable to this exception. But nonetheless, do all these signal a rise of protectionism and a retreat from free trade? Perhaps in Clive's view, it may not be, it is a retreat from free trade, but more, is this a development towards fair trade? But in whose view should this fairness, this fairness should be measured against what benchmark? And what would it mean for the WTO multilateral trading rules and system? So all this throws up a lot of questions. And let me just give one line and then I will end. If we were to look at the recent COVID situation, we also see many states challenging the system in terms of imposing export restrictions, including restrictions in terms of food and critical medical supplies, including medical equipment. So with all these export bans, it has clearly put a lot of strain on the multilateral trading system. So I will end here with the current trend of apparent development of protectionism, and then now with the advent of COVID, what will all this mean for the international trading system and international trade law? Will the current system be adequate to meet the challenges, especially the challenges that have thrown into the spotlight, especially during this COVID pandemic? So I will end here and pass the floor back to James.
Thank you so much, Daphne. That's great, especially reminding us about the challenges also in the international investment law framework. And now I will ask the team to kindly play the video from Kim Shin, who was unable to join us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eun Kyung Kim Shin. I'm a senior associate with Baker McKenzie located in Chicago. I am very glad to be presenting with such distinguished group of panelists here today. Today, I'm going to focus on certain industry trends that I have been observing from my capacity as a private practitioner and share a few observations that I've made, especially in connection to the US-China trade war. As many of you know, first of all, we've heard a lot about Section 301 duties in the last few years. As you know, these are the retaliatory tariffs authorized under Section 301 of the Trade Act. And I know there were a lot of political discussions around those retaliatory tariffs, but from a practical perspective, what we saw the most was the enormous administrative burden that fell on a lot of the U.S. importers. As you may recall, the way the retaliatory tariffs were rolled out were based on certain lists of different tariff items, and then with different dates, and the applicable duty rate will sometimes go up or down depending on the political tensions between the countries. And there were exclusion processes, which was really a welcomed news for a lot of importers, where you could come in and basically apply for an exclusion for your products. But the challenger was also that that also meant staff, actual people, had to keep track of different lists coming out, changes in retaliatory tariff rates, and also whether the exclusion applies or whether that was extended or the exclusion was not extended, etc. So we actually heard a lot in the past year or so, last 2 years, from companies expressing that a lot of their human resources and other capital and were dedicated to just keeping up with Section 301 compliance matters, such that it was often very difficult for a lot of companies to direct that resources for more, say, strategic import compliance issues or otherwise. Another thing we saw was, the big question that a lot of people asked at the onset of the U.S. trade war, especially in regards to the retaliatory tariffs, the Section 301 duties, was that would this change the actual global supply chain such that, for example, companies will move production out of China to a third country such as Malaysia, Vietnam, or Indonesia or elsewhere, and also with companies and start purchasing now from a non-Chinese supplier, given those retaliatory tariffs. From my very limited personal view, for a lot of companies, moving production, as you can imagine, it wasn't an easy task, especially given the uncertainties, right? But we have seen some companies, especially those who already had some manufacturing capacities in a third country. Let's say whether because you had a facility, say, in Malaysia, but you closed that facility down, 80% of it, and moved to China. In that case, for a lot of companies, it actually made sense then to bring the production back from China to Malaysia or any other countries where you might have some pre-existing manufacturing capacity, such that you can maneuver the retaliatory tariff issues. Otherwise, we've seen that it's really difficult. Again, the costs associated with it, and especially in light of the uncertainties surrounding the U.S.-China trade war. Also, of course, we live in a global supply chain world, and there are many choices when it comes down to which supplier you can buy from. Some companies were able to maneuver pretty quickly, and it was just a question of, do we pay a little more by going to a non-China supplier, but in return you can avoid these 25% very high retaliatory tariff duty rates. But for a lot of companies, the relationship that you build with a supplier can be such that, the cost aside, there's intellectual capital, investment, technology, and other relationships built in, such that I heard from a lot of companies saying, paying that 25% is actually cheaper, which is really unfortunate for a lot of U.S. importers, of course, who had to absorb the humongous increase in their raw materials, and in an already very competitive, challenging global market. Another aspect that we've seen a lot is also on the export side. As many of you here, of course, already know, the U.S. has rolled out various export regulations targeting China over the last few years. Just to use as an example, many of you know, a very major China-based company, Huawei, was included in a list called the Entity List, maintained by the U.S. Commerce Department. And what that meant was, it meant various things, but more significantly, what that meant was, if you were to export anything out of the U.S. to Huawei and a lot of these Huawei-related entities who are also included on the entity list, meant that you need an export license from the Department of Commerce, with an understanding that the license will be denied. And the way it rolled out was such that a lot of companies were caught off guard. When the restrictions came down, I believe most of them had an immediate effect, of course, with very limited savings clause provisions. So suddenly, literally, a lot of companies had an order that's already being, about to be shipped to China, to one of those Huawei companies, and elsewhere too, not just China, having to maneuver the fact that you can't make this export unless approval is obtained from the U.S. government, which was again very difficult. Another aspect of how the U.S. government has been dealing with the U.S.-China relationship on the export side is the heightened focus on due diligence. So, for example, the way the entity list restrictions worked out was such that if you have a customer that is, say, a subsidiary or affiliate of these Huawei entities that are on the entity list, but your customer itself isn't, the rule was that you could make this sale provided that there's no reason to believe the product that you're selling is ultimately destined for one of those restricted Huawei entities. So that meant for a lot of U.S. companies and others too, these restrictions can apply outside of the U.S. in certain circumstances, was that companies found themselves needing the facts and with the need to ask these hard, difficult questions vis-a-vis the customers to get comfortable about how the way in which the products will be used, again, in a way that a lot of companies were not used to handling. So these are the types of changes that we have seen. So I guess one industry trend that we're drawing from the U.S. how the U.S. government has been responding to the U.S.-China trade war on the export side is that any export, the entity list restriction is just one example. Any export that is related to China, not only to China, but it could relate to China, is under scrutiny. More and more restrictions are coming out, and of course, we do our best to monitor these developments and try to understand what impact those new developments may have on your bottom line and business. But frankly, a lot of times many of these developments are come very quickly, not leaving a lot of resources or leeways for companies to maneuver and adapt. And another thing I wanted to highlight, of course, is as you know, the NAFTA is being replaced effective July 1, and the new agreement, the USMCA, is going to be in effect. And this is also another area where a lot of companies had a good amount of time to get used to the new rules and make transitions. But given the sort of the lag or the political uncertainties, especially towards the end, the last few months by that of the process, we find that a lot of companies are now really gearing up to work out all the kinks that are needed to make sure you can still benefit from this new trade agreement. The underlying rules of origin are relatively, the same, unless you're in the auto sector, textile, apparel, chemicals, and steel industries, and a couple others. But that means, though, for those who are in those auto or steel, textile, apparel industries where the rules of origin really have changed, companies are really grappling with how to actually substantiate that you meet these new rules of origin. And auto cases specifically have gotten much tougher, and in implementing the needed record keeping and other compliance measures within the practice. So these are the few things I wanted to highlight, sort of the new trend or the industry trends that we've been seeing in light of the current developments. With that, I'll turn it over to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang Cheng. That was great. Now we have a few minutes left for discussion. And the question that I would like to pose to all the panelists is whether you think that one of the major strains or severe pressures that you have all talked about in both international trade law and international economic law is the loss of rules-based system, and whether we are moving rapidly to a power-based system. So we begin with Simon, Cliff, and then Daphne.
Thank you, James. That's a great question. I guess I would say that I do see a shift, but maybe it's not as great as we fear or might think. So you can imagine a continuum here of pure rules-based system and pure power-based system. And I would say, we've always been somewhat here in the middle. Perhaps we're moving a little bit towards power-based in some ways, but perhaps we're actually moving back towards rules-based in other ways. So, here I think this is, and I talked earlier about China versus the United States. I think this is mostly coming from the Trump administration, and that they have made statements and taken actions that clearly indicate, I think, that they'd like to move a little bit away from the rules-based system. They want more of a negotiation-based dispute settlement system where countries can talk about things more than litigate. And their actions at the appellate body are sort of right along these lines. You say, all right, well, look, the Trump administration is clearly taking us away from rules-based towards power-based because they feel like, well, the United States, that's an advantage to the United States. We have the power, so we'd rather be in a power-based system. At the same time, if you look at other areas, if you look at the renegotiated NAFTA, you can see we had a flawed NAFTA dispute settlement system that ended up being, we think, and it's not definitive, we don't see how the final rules yet, ended up being fixed and made more enforceable. And this is from pressure from the House Democrats as opposed to the Trump administration. But nevertheless, we could end up in a situation where the USMCA is more rules-based than NAFTA was. And similarly, staying with USMCA, we have new, very extensive disciplines on labor rights enforcement beyond anything we'd ever seen before. So it seems like we've gone further towards rules-based in the USMCA. So I think that yes, we are seeing a shift, and I think the Trump administration is engineering the shift. But it's sort of it's not all the way to power-based, and there are elements, there are aspects of the system that are moving more towards rules-based. So we do see a shift, but it's in different directions, and a little bit confusing exactly how far we've gone.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. I agree. This is a good question. Very good. My short answer is that the dynamics of the current international economic law seems to be that we are moving from a rule-based system to a power-based system. However, I concur in this regard. What Simon said, we are probably just moving toward somewhere in the middle. Um, um, I believe that this is a transformation period, and this is probably the reshaping period. Just following what I've mentioned, that the countries are now in search for a fair trade in their own perspective, of course, and then until the countries find their interests and their positions in the order, I believe that the order would become again be rule based. So now we are in the transformation period. So that would be the reason I believe that we are moving toward power-based. But sooner or later, I believe that it will be restored, maybe in a different way. That ends my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cliff. There's some promise, Daphne.
I concur with Cliff. As would be clear from my presentation, I do see that the international trading, the international investment, overall, the international economic law system is undergoing severe strain. WTO, we have countries denouncing bilateral investment treaties, etc. So I do see that we are going through a period of evolution, a period of transformation, and a great period of challenges, although it seems ironic to use the word great in this context. But nonetheless, I remained optimistic. So I actually agree with Clive that even though we are in this period of flux, you can actually already see signs of states starting with regions or groups of states now trying to also try to exert some control over the situation. Take, for example, the WTO appellate body challenge. 21 states have responded to it by coming together to conclude the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement in order to provide an interim appeal mechanism for WTO disputes. So I do believe that states realize the value of international trade. It is not going to be a situation of each country being an island unto themselves. It's just not realistic. It's not pragmatic. So ultimately, when it comes to international trade, international economic order, a certain amount of certainty and stability will be required for traders as well as for businessmen to do their job. So I do see that eventually there will be some order restored, even though things appear to be quite bleak at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Those are great words to end on. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their excellent presentations and for their very thoughtful remarks and for responding to that question. And I think we're done. So have a very good evening or good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
James, Simon, and Daphne.